The old stone church of St. Francis, nestled in the quiet town of Shelter Cove, California, had stood for over a century. Its pointed spire rose toward the sky like a finger of hope, piercing through the winter mist that rolled in from the Pacific Ocean. The townspeople, weary of life's toils and hardships, found solace in the worn pews beneath the vaulted ceiling painted with scenes of angels in flight. It was a place where hearts found comfort and broken spirits were lifted, especially on the sacred night of Christmas Eve. Father Michael Callahan was the guardian of this church. His weathered hands, marked by years of humble service, prepared for the evening's Christmas Eve service. His deep-set eyes, the color of storm clouds, reflected the weight of many stories, some of hope, others of quiet despair. His flock was small, no more than 40 souls, but their faith was resilient. And on this special night, when the world seemed a little more fragile and hearts a little more open, they would gather to remember the birth of a promise that, centuries ago, had been wrapped in swaddling clothes and laid in a manger. However, as Father Michael adjusted the faded green garland along the altar, there was a hint of anxiety within him that he could not shake. The town had not been spared the recent economic downturn. Jobs had become scarce, families had tightened their belts, and the whispers of desperation traveled faster than the ocean breeze. There had even been talk of petty crimes in the nearby towns, stories of people pushed by empty pantries to do the unthinkable. Despite the unease gnawing at him, Father Michael pressed on with his preparations. He glanced over at the simple nativity scene set beneath the pulpit, each wooden figure hand-carved decades before by a devoted parishioner long gone. Mary, serene and tender; Joseph, vigilant and noble; the shepherds and their flock, etched with rough yet loving detail. And nestled at the center, the tiny cradle for the infant Jesus, waiting to hold the figure only to be placed after midnight, when the first carol would ring out. As he knelt before the altar, whispering a prayer that the night would bring peace and renewal, a soft purr cut through the silence. It was Thomas, the tabby cat who had adopted St. Francis Church as his home. He was an old soul with mismatched green and blue eyes that seemed almost mystical. Father Michael chuckled, reaching out to scratch Thomas behind the ears. The cat had wandered in one stormy night years ago, drenched and half-starved. Since then, he had become as much a part of the church as the stained glass windows that threw shards of color onto the stone floor. "Tonight, Thomas," Father Michael said softly, "we pray for more than warmth and song. We pray for miracles." Thomas blinked, his eyes as deep and knowing as ever, before curling up at the foot of the nativity scene. Little did Father Michael know, a storm was about to arrive, not from the sea, but from the heart of human desperation. As twilight deepened, the church filled with the sounds of shuffling feet and whispered greetings. Old Mrs. Ellison, who walked with a cane and wore a lavender hat decorated with faux holly berries, settled into her usual spot in the first pew. The Willard family, their youngest son clutching his threadbare teddy bear, squeezed into the bench beside her. And then, from the shadows of the open church door, a tall figure entered. He moved with a stiffness that spoke of hesitance and hidden intention. Father Michael caught sight of the newcomer just as he was preparing to light the Advent candles. The man's face was rugged, framed by unkempt hair, and his clothes were worn thin. But it was the man's eyes, sunken and haunted, that struck a chord within the priest. The music of the choir began to fill the sanctuary, but the stranger's gaze never softened. Thomas, who had been napping peacefully, opened one eye, his ears twitching as if sensing the tension that nobody else noticed. As the congregation stood to sing "O Holy Night," Father Michael's voice quavered for the briefest moment. He met the stranger's gaze, and in that instant, he felt the weight of an untold story pressing into the room. The church, warm with candlelight and hope, became a fragile barrier against whatever pain had followed this man into their midst. Thomas watched from the shadows, his tail flicking as if in anticipation of something unseen. The night was about to take an unexpected turn. The final notes of "O Holy Night" faded into the rafters, settling like soft snow on the congregation. Father Michael stepped forward, his gaze sweeping the familiar faces before him. He spoke of hope and redemption, his voice steady despite the lingering unease simmering in his chest. The stranger, who had taken a seat at the back of the church, kept his head down, hands clenched into fists on his lap. Thomas, now fully awake, watched him with an intensity that seemed almost human. As Father Michael began reading from the Gospel, a sudden crash shattered the serenity. The stained glass window to the left of the sanctuary splintered inward, a jagged shower of colored shards glistening in the candlelight. Screams pierced the silence, and the church erupted into chaos. The air crackled with the stunned gasps of the congregation and the scrape of pews being pushed back in frantic movements. Amid the confusion, the stranger sprang to his feet, his eyes wide with panic as he fumbled in his coat pocket. Father Michael's heart thudded against his ribs as he watched the man pull out a tarnished handgun. The room froze, the air thick with disbelief and fear. "Everybody down," the man yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. The choir's hymn books fell with dull thuds as the young singers clutched each other in terror. Mrs. Ellison, unable to move fast enough, looked up with eyes full of uncomprehending fear. The Willard boy dropped his teddy bear, which landed on the cold stone floor, forgotten in the terror of the moment. Father Michael raised a trembling hand. "Please, son, you don't have to do this," he said, his voice steadying as he drew on every ounce of the strength he'd cultivated over years of shepherding souls through hardship. The man's eyes darted around the room, his chest heaving with each ragged breath. Thomas moved, silent as a shadow, slipping between the pews until he was mere feet from the stranger. His mismatched eyes locked onto the man, a gentle rumble of a purr beginning to fill the tense air. It was a sound that seemed oddly out of place, soft and familiar amidst the hard edge of fear. "Shut up," the man shouted, the gun trembling in his hand. The congregation cowered, a collective gasp sucking the air from the room. Father Michael took a step forward, ignoring the sharp stares of warning from the people around him. "I can see you're in pain," Father Michael said, his voice as steady as the ocean's tide. "Tell us what you need. We're here to listen." The man's jaw tightened, and a tear tracked down the grime on his cheek. He looked no older than 30, yet his face was carved by lines of suffering that belonged to someone far older. Thomas took another step closer, his fur brushing against the stranger's leg. The man flinched but did not push him away. For a moment, the only sounds were the crackle of the candles and Thomas's insistent purring. I need money," the man stuttered, his eyes now darting between the frightened congregation and Father Michael. "My little girl, she's sick and I can't pay for her medicine." A murmur of pity rippled through the church. Mrs. Ellison clasped her hands tighter, whispering a prayer under her breath. The Willard boy, no longer afraid, picked up his teddy bear and hugged it to his chest, his wide eyes watching as the scene unfolded. Father Michael took a deep breath. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice carrying the same compassion he reserved for the confessional, where the most broken spirits laid bare their sins. The man's eyes flickered with confusion and shame. "Jacob," he whispered, his voice cracking as the tension in his body seemed to splinter. He lowered the gun a fraction, and the room collectively exhaled. Thomas, as if sensing the shift, rubbed his head against Jacob's shin, the purr deepening into a soothing hum that resonated in the hollow spaces of the church. Jacob looked down at the cat, his expression softening as he took in the animal's odd eyes, one blue as the sky, the other green as spring leaves. A look passed between man and cat, a silent understanding that words could not touch. Jacob's hand, once white-knuckled around the gun, loosened. Tears welled up and overflowed as he choked on a sob. He dropped to his knees, the gun clattering harmlessly to the floor. In that moment, time seemed to hold its breath. Thomas stepped onto Jacob's lap and nuzzled his face, the gesture so simple yet powerful, it shattered the last of the man's resolve. He wept openly, shoulders shaking as years of pent-up fear and guilt broke free like a dam giving way. Father Michael approached cautiously, his heart pounding not with fear, but with hope. He placed a hand on Jacob's shoulder, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the church was silent again, not with terror, but with an almost holy quiet. "We will help you, Jacob," Father Michael said softly, his eyes brimming with tears that mirrored those of his congregation. "You are not alone." The congregation, still trembling from the shock, began to rise, their eyes no longer filled with fear but with empathy. Mrs. Ellison, leaning heavily on her cane, was the first to step forward, placing a trembling hand over her heart as if to soothe the ache. One by one, people gathered around, their fear replaced by the glow of compassion. Thomas leapt down from Jacob's lap, his job seemingly done, and padded back to his spot by the nativity scene. He settled down with a contented sigh, curling into a ball as if he had known all along that this night, above all nights, was meant for miracles. Jacob sat in a puddle of his own shame and relief, the gun now a harmless piece of metal far from his reach. The congregation, slowly moving closer, formed a circle around him, each face showing a mixture of compassion, curiosity, and an unspoken question. How could they help this man who, just moments before, had shattered the sanctity of their Christmas Eve? Father Michael's hand remained firm on Jacob's shoulder. He could feel the young man's body trembling, not with the chill of the winter night but with the raw exposure of vulnerability. The silence stretched, wrapping around them like a cloak, until Mrs. Ellison broke it with her frail, quivering voice. "Father Michael, what do we do now?" she asked, her eyes fixed on Jacob, who sat like a fallen angel among them. Before the priest could respond, Thomas, with the grace of a creature unbound by human complexities, stood and stretched. His eyes, one green and one blue, surveyed the scene as though he were its quiet orchestrator. He padded over to the center of the circle, weaving his way through legs and crumpled hymnals. The cat paused in front of Jacob, meeting his eyes with a look so steady and calm that it seemed almost sentient. For a heartbeat, everything else melted away. Only Jacob and Thomas existed in that shared gaze. It was Mrs. Ellison who took the first step. She hobbled forward, her cane tapping softly against the stone floor, and extended her hand to Jacob. He stared at it, bewildered, as though the gesture was a language he could not comprehend. His rough fingers, chapped and scarred from years of labor and loss, hesitated before touching hers. "I have a little saved up," she said, her voice cracking with age and emotion. "It's not much, but maybe it'll help your little girl." Jacob's eyes filled again, and his face crumpled as he accepted the hand that lifted him, not just from the floor but from the pit of his despair. A murmur rippled through the congregation, and soon others came forward. The Willard boy slipped from his mother's grasp and laid his teddy bear at Jacob's feet. "It's for your daughter," he whispered, his voice small but resolute. His mother pressed her lips together to stifle a sob, pride and heartache mingling in her chest. One by one, the townspeople offered what they could, small bills crumpled from worn wallets, promises of meals, blankets, prayers. Each gift was an unspoken testament to the bond that had always existed among them, even in the hardest of times. The church, no longer a building of stone and wood, became a sanctuary of shared humanity, wrapped in the spirit of giving. Jacob looked around, overwhelmed, clutching the small pile of offerings that had been thrust into his arms. His voice, raw and hoarse, managed a single phrase. "Thank you. I didn't deserve this, not after what I almost did." Father Michael's hand moved from Jacob's shoulder to the center of his back, a fatherly touch that spoke of forgiveness and grace. "We all have our moments, Jacob. What matters is what comes after." Thomas circled the priest's feet, brushing against the hem of his robe, as if to remind them that their miracle was not yet complete. It was then that Father Michael had an idea, one so audacious it caught even him by surprise. "Jacob, where is your daughter?" he asked, the urgency in his voice cutting through the lingering unease. Jacob blinked, confusion clouding his face. "At home. Just a few blocks away. The fever, it's bad. I didn't know what else to do." "We need to go to her," Father Michael said, turning to the congregation. "Please, those of you who can, stay and continue the service. But if there are any among you who know of healing remedies or have warm blankets to spare, follow us." A small group broke off, ready to assist. Mrs. Ellison nodded, her eyes bright with purpose despite the years that weighed on her body. The Willard family moved as one, the father grabbing coats from a nearby rack while the mother gathered a few candles to light the way. Jacob's face was a mixture of hope and disbelief. He glanced down at Thomas, who, as if on cue, trotted toward the church door and paused, looking back over his shoulder with an air that said, "What are you waiting for?" Father Michael smiled, a fleeting expression of awe crossing his face. "Lead the way, Thomas," he whispered as the cat darted out into the cold night. The town was cloaked in frost, the air biting against their skin as they hurried down the narrow, cobblestone streets. Snow had started to fall in soft flurries, dancing in the beams of light that spilled from street lamps. Thomas moved ahead, his small, agile form navigating the twists and turns as if he knew exactly where to go. Behind him, the group hurried, their breath misting in the winter air, eyes fixed on the cat that led them. Jacob's house was nothing more than a rundown cottage on the edge of town, its paint peeling and shutters hanging loose. Inside, the air was heavy with the sickly warmth of a fire barely keeping the room above freezing. On a worn couch, wrapped in thin blankets, lay a small girl no older than 7. Her skin was flushed with fever, and her breaths came in shallow, labored gasps. "Emily," Jacob choked out, rushing to her side. He fell to his knees, taking her tiny hand in his and pressing it to his lips. Her eyelids fluttered, and a weak smile curved her lips. "Papa," she whispered, her voice faint as the wind outside. Father Michael stepped forward, kneeling beside them, while Thomas leapt onto the armrest of the couch. The cat's eyes, shining with their peculiar dual colors, met Emily's. For a moment, they stared at each other, and a calmness seemed to settle over the room, as if the fever that gripped her loosened its hold under Thomas's gaze. Mrs. Ellison shuffled to Emily's other side and placed a cool cloth on her forehead. The Willards worked quickly, setting up the blankets and lighting the candles to add more warmth and light. And all the while, Thomas remained by Emily, his purrs vibrating gently through the air like the softest lullaby. It was in that dimly lit room, surrounded by friends and strangers who had come together in an act of pure love, that something shifted. Emily's breathing deepened, steadied, and her eyes opened wider, focusing on Thomas with wonder. "Papa, the kitty," she said, her voice stronger now. Jacob glanced at Thomas, tears streaming down his face. "Yes, sweetheart. The kitty." Father Michael rose slowly, the awe in his eyes reflecting that of everyone present. Thomas blinked, first with his sky blue eye, then with the green, before settling down next to Emily, content and watchful. Outside, the snow fell heavier, but inside that humble room, warmth bloomed, carrying with it the whispers of a miracle. The night deepened, and the flurries outside transformed into a steady snowfall, cloaking the town in a blanket of white. Inside Jacob's small cottage, time seemed to slow. The steady crackle of the fire mixed with the gentle purring of Thomas as he lay beside Emily, his warm body pressed against her as if guarding her fragile life. The air in the room, heavy with the scent of burning wood and faint medicinal herbs, was filled with something else too, hope. Mrs. Ellison sat in a chair at Emily's side, her old hands deftly mixing together a poultice from herbs she had carried in her bag. She spread the paste across Emily's chest with the tenderness of a grandmother, whispering an old prayer learned in her childhood. Jacob watched, eyes wide with hope and fear warring inside him. Father Michael moved through the room with quiet purpose. He turned to the Willards, who stood in a corner, huddled in their coats but unwilling to leave. "Mr. Willard, could you fetch the doctor? I know it's late, but I believe he would come if we asked." Mr. Willard nodded without hesitation and stepped out into the biting wind. His wife knelt by the couch, adding another layer of blankets over Emily, whose breathing had steadied since their arrival. The small girl's eyes, dark with fever moments ago, now glistened with a trace of color, and her cheeks, once pale, had the faintest blush. Jacob leaned in, his voice trembling as he spoke to his daughter. "Emily, can you hear me, sweetheart?" She blinked slowly, eyes moving from his face to Thomas, who lay so still he could have been mistaken for a carved statue. Then, in a voice soft but clear, she said, "Papa, the kitty makes me feel safe." A collective sigh rippled through the room. Mrs. Ellison dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, muttering a quiet, "Thank the Lord." Father Michael's heart swelled with a gratitude so profound it threatened to undo him. He had witnessed many small miracles in his years of service, acts of kindness that defied human logic, moments of unexpected grace, but none as immediate or as tangible as this. Thomas lifted his head, eyes sharp as the winter stars outside, and meowed softly as if to say, "I'm not done yet." He stood and moved to the center of the room, sitting in a patch of moonlight that had managed to filter through the frosty window pane. His purring, which had faded as Emily stabilized, grew louder, filling the room with a sound so rich it seemed to vibrate in their chests. Jacob stared, disbelief painted across his weary features. It was as if the cat's very presence was weaving a thread of healing into the room, stitching closed the tear that fear had left in his heart. Minutes felt like hours as they waited, the stillness broken only by the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. Then, from the doorway, a knock. The doctor, a portly man with kind eyes, stepped inside, snowflakes melting on his wool coat. Mr. Willard followed close behind, his face flushed from the cold but triumphant. Dr. Avery glanced around the room, taking in the scene before him. The small girl on the couch, now looking up at him with fever-bright eyes, the anxious father, the old woman applying compresses, and, most curiously, the tabby cat whose mismatched eyes seemed to shine with intelligence. Without a word, he set down his medical bag and went to work, checking Emily's temperature, pulse, and breathing. "It's a high fever, but it seems to be breaking," he said after a moment, his voice reassuring. "Whatever you've been doing, it's working. Keep her warm and hydrated, and she should pull through." The relief in the room was palpable. Jacob clutched Father Michael's hand, unable to speak but pouring all his gratitude into that single touch. The priest nodded, eyes damp as he squeezed back. Thomas, now sitting beside Dr. Avery, looked up and gave a single, decisive meow, as if he were agreeing with the doctor's prognosis. The room erupted into soft laughter, nervous and relieved, melting the last of the fear that had frozen them. "I've never seen a cat quite like that," Dr. Avery remarked as he packed up his instruments, glancing down at Thomas. "He seems special." Father Michael exchanged a glance with Mrs. Ellison, who nodded sagely. "He is," the priest said. "Tonight, he was our angel." As the night waned and the first light of dawn began to creep into the sky, the little cottage became a scene of quiet celebration. Mrs. Ellison dozed in her chair, her wrinkled face peaceful. The Willits, after making sure Jacob and Emily had everything they needed, returned to the church to tell the others what had happened. Dr. Avery left with a promise to return later in the day, and Father Michael stayed, sitting in a corner and watching as Jacob, now seated on the floor beside the couch, held Emily's hand while she drifted in and out of sleep. Thomas, true to his nature, circled the room one last time before leaping gracefully onto the windowsill. He gazed out at the snow-covered town, the soft glow of streetlights still burning before they would yield to the sun. His ears flicked as he heard the distant chime of the church bell, marking the dawn of Christmas Day. He turned back, his eyes landing on Father Michael, who met his gaze with a smile. "Thank you, Thomas," Father Michael whispered, though he knew the cat would never answer in words. But in that moment, the old tabby blinked slowly, a gesture that, in the world of cats, was said to mean "I love you." As the first rays of Christmas morning light crept across the snow-draped town of Shelter Cove, the little cottage where Jacob and Emily lived felt transformed. The room, which had once echoed with loneliness and despair, now hummed with warmth and renewal. Emily, now breathing deeply and steadily, slept under the watchful eyes of her father, who held her hand as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Beside her, Thomas lay curled, his mismatched eyes closing in satisfaction as he, too, allowed himself to rest. Father Michael rose from his chair, the stiffness in his old bones nothing compared to the joy swelling within him. He glanced at Jacob, who looked up and managed a weak, grateful smile. No words passed between them, they didn't need any. The room was filled with the silent understanding that a miracle had taken place, not just in Emily's healing, but in the collective act of love and compassion that had brought it about. Outside, the church bells began to ring, a chorus announcing the arrival of Christmas Day. The sound echoed through the streets, waking the town and stirring in them the stories they would share, the tale of a Christmas Eve unlike any other, when desperation turned to redemption, and a humble tabby cat reminded them all that miracles could come in the smallest, most unexpected forms. Thomas opened one eye, as if he heard the bells and approved of their song. He stretched lazily, then nestled deeper into the blankets, content in the knowledge that he was exactly where he needed to be. Father Michael stepped outside, taking in the fresh morning air that carried whispers of pine and ocean salt. The snow sparkled under the rising sun, painting the town in hues of gold and silver. For the first time in what felt like years, he allowed himself to truly believe in the power of the season, not just as a symbol, but as a living testament to hope, faith, and the quiet heroism found in the most unexpected places. As the bells continued to ring and the town awoke, Father Michael whispered a prayer of gratitude, not only for the life saved but for the spirit of the community that had been rekindled. And in the warm, quiet cottage, Thomas, the unassuming tabby, became part of a story that would be told for generations. One that proved that miracles are not just found in grand gestures but in the quiet moments of love, the flicker of a candle, and the soft, insistent purr of a cat who had always known where he belonged.